Excellent.
Okay, great. Thank you all for watching. So this talk will be broadly speaking about the relationship between language use and social cognition. And we focused on demonstrative systems, which are words like this versus that, as a case study for this question. And the general approach we used is a combination of experimental work and computational modeling in order to investigate how these demonstratives are used flexibly to establish joint attention. All of the work I'm presenting here is joint work with Paula Rubio-Fernandez and Julián Jara-Ettinger. And as I said, the overarching question for this project was how much social cognition is necessary for language use. But instead of focusing on, let's say, more complex pragmatic phenomena like, for example, scalar and ligature, we instead decided to look at a more sort of core feature of grammar, which is demonstrative systems, which are words like this versus that, or here versus there. So they form like small closed class systems within our language of deictic terms, so terms of which the meaning depends on, or the referent depends on the context and who is using the word. And they are used for to establish and maintain joint attention. Now, why do I call these demonstratives core features of our grammar? Well, they are universal in the sense that every language has them. They are historically old, so they cannot really be traced back to any other type of word, and they are learned early. But of course, we are not the first people to notice that there is a social dimension to the use of demonstrative terms. In linguistic typology, languages across the world have traditionally been sort of classified in terms of whether they are, here I call them egocentric versus allocentric systems. The actual technical typological terms are distance-oriented versus person-oriented. But I'm using egocentric and allocentric because I think the terms are a little bit more transparent.
Hello, excuse me?
Oh.
Hi.
Hi.
I think this might be the wrong room or something. Because this is, yeah, I think you might be in the wrong room. It's the right person? Oh, it's the right person. Okay, sorry. We missed the beginning. Could you please start over?
Oh, I should start over?
Marieke, sorry. My name is Peng. I'm the chair of this session, and sorry, we have a little bit technical issue just now, so we just get started. So sorry about that. And for the audience in the room, you are in the Pragmatics 1 session. So let me just introduce our first speaker, Marieke, and take it away. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, for the people in the Zoom room, I'll just redo the introduction of the talk. So thank you all for watching. Also those in the physical room over there in Toronto. Nice to have you here. This talk will be broadly speaking about the relationship between language use and social cognition. And we use demonstrative terms as a sort of case study for this question. And so words like this versus that. And the approach we use in this study, in this project, is a combination of experimental work and computational modeling in order to investigate how these demonstrative words are used flexibly to establish joint attention. Now, all the work I'm presenting here is joint work with Paula Rubio-Fernandez and Julián Jara-Ettinger. And as I mentioned, the overarching question for this project was, how does social cognition get applied in language use? And instead of focusing on, let's say, more complex pragmatic phenomena like scalar and ligature, for example, we decided to focus instead on a more, let's say, core feature of our grammar, specifically demonstrative systems. Now, demonstratives are words like this versus that, or here versus there. So they form sort of small closed class systems within our grammar of deictic terms, so terms of which the meaning depends on the context and who uses them. And they are used to maintain and establish joint attention. Now, why do I say that demonstratives are core features of our grammar? Well, demonstratives are universal in the sense that all languages have them. They are historically old, so they cannot really be traced back to any other type of word, and they are learned early. Now, of course, we are not the first people to notice that there is a social dimension, perhaps, to the use of demonstrative words. In fact, in linguistic typology, a classification has been made between what I call here egocentric demonstrative systems versus allocentric demonstrative systems. The actual technical linguistic typology terms are distance-oriented systems versus person-oriented systems. Here I use egocentric and allocentric because I think the terms are a bit more transparent. So in an egocentric or distance-oriented system, what happens is that which demonstrative you use depends solely on the distance of the referent from you as a producer. So if you imagine that you're the avatar there at the top right in this image, and you're trying to explain to your friend which of these objects you need, if you speak an egocentric or distance-oriented language like English or Italian, you would just refer to objects closer to you as this or this one, and objects further away from you as that or that one. But which demonstrative you use doesn't depend on the position or perspective of the receiver. That's different from an allocentric or person-oriented system, where which demonstrative you use depends not just on the distance of the referent from you as a producer, but also on the distance of the referent from the receiver. Specifically, if you speak an allocentric or person-oriented language like Portuguese or Spanish, you would use este in Spanish for a referent that's close to you as a speaker, ese for a referent that's further away from you as a speaker, but close to the receiver. And finally, aquel for a referent that's far away from both of you. So as you can see, some degree of social information is used at least in an allocentric language, because there the speaker has to monitor the receiver's perspective or spatial location in order to use this demonstrative system correctly. Now, in this project or in this talk, I will describe two different studies. In the first study, we asked whether we can reproduce this typological classification of languages in a controlled experimental setting, because of course, these typological classifications have been based on observation. And we also asked whether we can then extract what these participants in our experiment are actually doing using a computational model. And in study 2, we go a bit further to ask whether speakers also use these demonstratives flexibly to redirect the receiver's attention. So not just monitoring the receiver's spatial location, but also monitoring their attention and redirecting it by using demonstrative terms flexibly. Starting with study 1, we developed an experiment to see whether speakers of different languages monitor the receiver's spatial location when they use demonstrative words. So what we did in this experiment, here you can see 4 different trials from the experiment displayed next to each other, is we manipulated the receiver's spatial location. So the receiver is the avatar there at the bottom, and their location differs between the different trials. So their spatial location relative to the target referent, which is indicated by the dashed lines that show the speaker's line of sight. And we asked participants to select the most appropriate demonstrative word to use in these different situations. So this is an example of a trial where the target referent is far from, well, somewhat further away from the speaker, but close to the receiver. And here's an example of a trial where the target referent is further away from both the speaker and the receiver. And we combined this experiment with a computational model in which we wanted to capture this idea that the speaker monitors the receiver's spatial location depending on which system they are using. So whether they're using an egocentric or an allocentric system. And in order to capture this difference between egocentric system and allocentric system, we used as a baseline assumption in the model that in deciding which utterance to use, the producer takes into account the receiver's expected visual search for the referent. So in other words, when a speaker produces a demonstrative, they're trying to minimize the time that the listener is looking around for the object. And we captured the difference between egocentric and allocentric by assigning different association strengths to the different demonstrative terms, depending on the location of the referent relative to the speaker and the receiver. So in an egocentric system, you see that the association strength of the proximal term to a referent increases as the referent gets closer to the speaker, whereas the association strength of a distal term, like appel or that, increases as the referent gets further away from the speaker. So the egocentric system is pretty simple. The allocentric system is a bit more complex, where the proximal and distal term behave pretty much the same, but the medial term, like ese in Spanish, for that term, the association strength of a referent increases when it gets not just further away from the speaker, but also closer to the receiver. So these are the baseline association strengths of the words with given reference in the situation. And we, on top of that, assume that our speakers do some pragmatic reasoning over these sort of baseline visual search costs. So on top of a sort of simple producer who would just, for whom the utility of a word would just be inversely proportional to the visual search cost for a simple receiver, where that simple receiver would just look at each referent with a probability proportional to the association strength with the word, according to the table I just showed you. On top of this sort of simple idea, we build a layer of pragmatic reasoning based on the rational speech act model, where we assume a pragmatic receiver who uses Bayesian inference to determine the probability of a given referent given the word that they received by choosing an interpretation R proportionally to the probability that a simple producer would produce that word for that referent. And on top of that, we assume a pragmatic producer who reasons about such a pragmatic receiver and then chooses utterances approximately rationally by softmaxing the probability that a pragmatic receiver would interpret the word as the target referent R. So altogether, the complete model assumes such a pragmatic producer as the model of what our participants in the experiment are doing. But we have two versions of this model, the egocentric one and the allocentric one. And what we then did is a model comparison to see which of these two versions of the model fits the data from the experiment best for the different languages that we collected data from. And what we found in this model comparison is that for English and Italian, the egocentric computational model fits the data best, whereas for Portuguese and Spanish, the allocentric computational model fits the participant data best. And here you can see the corresponding mean Bayes factors across a range of possible parameter settings and the corresponding sort of evidence strength category that they fall in. So how strong is the evidence in favor of the best fitting model? Here falling in the categories very strong or extreme. And finally, what I will show you is the which of these two models comes out as the best fitting model across a whole range of possible parameter settings. And I'm showing you this because we have no particular a priori reasons to assume a particular parameter setting. And what we see is that indeed for English and Italian, overall, the distance-oriented or egocentric model tends to fit best, whereas for Portuguese and Spanish, the person-oriented or allocentric model tends to fit best. So to summarize study one, we found that our model, based on visual search cost reasoning plus pragmatic reasoning, captures the typological pattern, the typological classification of these languages. And in experiment two, instead of looking at monitoring of spatial location, we looked at whether speakers also monitor the receiver's attention. So in order to, the idea behind this is that we wanted to know whether producers use demonstratives flexibly to redirect the receiver's attention. So imagine you're in this situation Normally, you might use in English the word this because the object is relatively close to you. But now imagine that your friend is looking at an object that's even closer to you than the one that you mean or want to refer to. In that case, if you use your demonstratives flexibly, you might use that instead, which is normally associated with objects further away, but it might result in your friend reorienting their attention. Now, in order to see whether speakers indeed use their demonstratives flexibly in this way, we, in study 2 or experiment 2, instead of manipulating the receiver's location, we instead manipulated the receiver's attention relative to the target referent. So here you again see 4 different trials from the experiment next to each other. Here you see an example of a trial where the perspectives are aligned between speaker and listener. And here you see other trials where the perspectives are misaligned. Now, in the model that we used for experiment 2, what we did is we used the same baseline models for the egocentric and the allocentric version, but we built a attention correction variant model on top of each of them, where all that happens in the attention correction variant is that when a receiver's attention is focused further away than the speaker's intended referent, the association strength of a proximal term like this, or este, becomes higher. And as the receiver's attention is focused closer than the speaker's intended referent, the association strength of a distal term like aquel or that becomes higher. And what we did in the model comparison is, instead of comparing the baseline egocentric and allocentric model, we instead compared the baseline model that came out as best fitting from study 1 for each of the languages with the corresponding attention correction variant for each of the languages. And what we found is that for English and Italian, we got quite ambiguous results. It was not possible to tell which of those 2 models fits best, the baseline one or the attention correction one. But for Portuguese and Spanish, we see clearly that participants indeed do this type of attention monitoring and redirecting of attention by using their demonstratives flexibly. This is what those results look like. Here you see the robustness check across a range of parameter settings, where you see that for English and Italian, which model fits best depends a lot on the parameter settings, whereas for Portuguese and Spanish, overall the attention correction variant performs better than the baseline person-oriented model. So and I can show you an example trial or 2 example trials from the experiment, just to give you a sort of more detailed idea of what happens. Here I'm showing you this particular aligned trial versus this particular misaligned trial. And I'm showing you the model predictions at the top for a particular language, and then the human data at the bottom. And what we see is that in the misaligned trial compared to the aligned trial, so in the misaligned trial, the listener is looking too closer than the speaker's intended referent. And what happens is that both the model and also the human participants increase their use of the more distal term that's usually associated with a reference further away to redirect the listener's attention. And here you see the same results for Spanish, also an increase of the distal use of the distal term in the misaligned trial. So to summarize, producers can use their demonstratives flexibly to redirect their listener's attention, at least in the case of an allocentric system with 3 different demonstrative terms. And we're currently working on figuring out a more sensitive experiment and or sensitive analysis of the results to see what causes the ambiguous results in the English and Italian participants. Okay, thank you very much.